It's great to welcome Bob Kuttner to the program today, who is co-editor of the American Prospect magazine, also chair at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. I really appreciate your time today. Thanks for being on.
Pleasure to be with you.
So I've been interested in the idea of economic nationalism for some time. And one of the, I guess, where we can maybe start is whether there is some inconsistency among some on the left on this issue, because I'm still developing sort of my sense of this, but there is a sort of global egalitarianism that I see from many who, like me, describe themselves as being on the left and progressives that seems to stop short when it comes to, well, we should have an economy that prioritizes the American worker. We should have trade deals that are best for the United States. Is there a conflict or an inconsistency there?
Not necessarily, and I think it's really important to start out by defining what we mean. And I think economic nationalism means two different things that sometimes get conflated rather sloppily. So
Good.
let's start with that.
Please.
So if you are a Roosevelt progressive and you're not a neoliberal, and you think that capitalism is predatory, and in order to have a system that is efficient and socially just, the government has to be involved big time. A democratic government has to be involved big time in regulating capitalism. That means that you have to put limits on globalism, because if you have what we've had for the past 30 or 40 years with the WTO and the use of trade deals to undercut the regulation of capitalism, you can't regulate capitalism. I mean, banks can go offshore, and we don't care whether products that we import are made with slave labor. You know the whole litany.
Sure.
So sure. Economic nationalism, in one sense of the word, simply means that we have to regulate capitalism, and we, for better or worse, is the nation state. There's no global economy. You can't regulate capitalism with the Republic of NAFTA. You have to regulate it with the United States of America, where I'm a citizen and you're a citizen.
And to some degree, is that also just the practicality of legal framework and just sort of the limits of what any one group can do? I mean, I know we have NATO, we have we have these organizations, but does it get sloppy?
Well, it's about sovereignty.
Yeah.
If you want to try and regulate capitalism, you need a degree of sovereignty, and the state is sovereign. And there is no sovereignty globally except to the extent that you have treaties. Okay.
Right.
The other kind of economic nationalism, of which Trump is the extreme example, or maybe Hitler is the more extreme example, is America first or Germany first, and screw the rest of the world. And so where it gets tricky is on the question of how you make it possible for the whole world to regulate capitalism in the interest of ordinary people. And since we don't have a global government, that means you have to have agreements, you have to have treaties. This morning's New York Times reports that the EU is going to have climate tariffs. If you try to export stuff into the EU that are made with processes and products that pollute, you're going to have to pay a tariff. Now, that's a good kind of nationalism. And Biden's talking about doing the same thing. So the tricky part, for me anyway, because I'm a third world guy as well as a New Dealer, how do you extend this so that the whole world is able to regulate predatory capitalism? And interestingly, that is what was attempted in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, where the architect of that conference was John Maynard Keynes. He got a do-over. They got it wrong at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, where he was a junior economic advisor to the British government. He quit in disgust, in protest. And then 25 years later, he was the chair of the Bretton Woods Conference, and he said, we have to orchestrate the rules of the global system so that every country gets to regulate capitalism in the interest of workers, in the interest of citizens. Now, here's the tricky part. You get down to cases. So if we think that China is predatory, we think that China violates human rights, we think that China violates the rules of the trading system where they subsidize and they dump and they steal intellectual property and all that stuff. And so we're going to have an industrial policy. and we're going to have a national security policy where certain technologies we're not going to allow China to acquire. That seems pretty sensible to have an industrial policy. Where do you draw the line? And is that an industrial policy for the United States, or is that an industrial policy that the EU and all of the democracies are part of? And then if that's the case, who gets the business? So, for instance, there are three major chip companies that are not Chinese that make state-of-the-art chips. One's Intel, the other two are European, Ericsson and Nokia. So do you have a cartel? Do you carve up the market? Or do you say we have one set of rules for companies that play by, democratic norms and market norms, and a different set of rules for China, which doesn't play by market norms? So where it gets tricky is around the edges, where when you get down to cases. And here's Vietnam, third world country, a dictatorship, but not as nasty a dictatorship as China. And a lot of stuff gets outsourced to Vietnam by American companies. And these are very poor people who need the work. This is where it gets tricky. And so you have to have trade agreements that are very different from the kind of trade agreements that Clinton and Obama made, that have human rights in them, that have some concern for the ability of third world countries to get a foot on the ladder so that they can have decent living standards for their people, but not simply turning the world over to multinational corporations.
Yeah, and I wanted to, let's talk a little bit about trade if we can, because the concept of free trade being a net positive is rooted in some pretty traditional economic ideas of specialization and relative efficiencies of producing and exporting products. And it really goes back to a lot of that traditional economics. And at the end of the day, as you're pointing out, sometimes the best way to control conditions when it comes to labor and products and imports is you bring the supply lines domestic. But at the same time, then you're depriving, as you point out, a lot of people around the world of the ability to better themselves and better their economic situation. So how should we interpret all of that and sort of parse it?
Let me address what you said about trade being efficient, and then let me respond to the second question.
Yeah.
Well, here's a conundrum. David Ricardo, et cetera, theory of comparative advantage.
Yep.
Trade is efficient because of specialization. Okay, but hold on. We have known ever since Roosevelt, and before really, that free markets are not efficient, right? Markets price things wrong. Markets price carbon wrong. Lord Nicholas Stern said, global climate change is history's epic case of market failure.
Right.
Markets price labor wrong because corporations have the power to really exploit workers. Markets price all kinds of stuff wrong. They price housing wrong. So question, how is it that we need to have a managed form of capitalism domestically because markets price things wrong, and then somehow when you cross borders, all of a sudden markets price things right? And the answer is they don't. And this gets into power relationships. You want third world countries to be able to get jobs and gain market share, but you don't want them to exploit their workers. So let me give you an example of a trade deal that I think was a pretty good trade deal.
Yeah.
There used to be something called the multi-fiber agreement. It was a worldwide cartel for textiles and apparel. And the idea was that we're going to give every country that wants to export textile products into the United States a quota. And the economists said, this is terrible. This is a cartel. This violates the free market. And the other side of the argument was, well, if you just eliminate it, China will get everything because China will underprice everybody and all these other countries will get the short end of the stick.
Common argument.
Huh?
Commonly heard, commonly repeated, yes.
Yeah. So what they did for a while, this was in the last 2 years of Clinton when Bob Rice was Secretary of Labor and actually had some influence, they made an agreement. Cambodia was the model country. And the agreement was, if you follow International Labor Organization norms and you give workers the right to organize, we will give you additional quota slots under the multi-fiber arrangement. And so, thanks to that, the labor movement got a foothold in Cambodia, and workers actually started being paid better. It didn't hurt their market share, it helped their market share. And then, of course, the Republicans come in and they just blow away the whole thing. So there's a middle ground. I guess this is my punchline.
Yeah.
There's a middle ground between absolutely free trade, which is a mirage anyway, and Trumpian economic nationalism, which is a kind of negotiated trade where you have some norms, where you have some standards, and the standards are not just a covert way of screwing the third world. And a lot of the third world diplomats have made the argument that the West is hypocritical. The West talks about the International Labor Organization, talks about labor standard. That's just protectionist. And again, you got to get down to cases. Depending on the particular rules that are negotiated, it can be protectionist, or it can be in the interest of workers everywhere. And so you have the case of the Bangladesh, horrible Bangladesh fires, where this is a very dirt poor country, needs the job so that workers don't die in fires, but you don't do that as a covert way of depressing their market share. You've got to get down to cases. I guess that's the point.
The last thing I wanted to touch on briefly relates to the coronavirus pandemic. We've talked to economists, social psychologists, all sorts of different folks about the impacts that they see as a result of the coronavirus pandemic and what we've sort of learned from it. When it comes to an economic nationalism perspective, globalization, supply chains, et cetera, what do you see as the big takeaways from the pandemic?
Well, I think, and it's not just the pandemic. I mean, the fortunate thing about the pandemic is that it moves this center stage and gets people talking about it. So I think it demonstrated that reliance on supply chains, a lot of which are in countries who are not necessarily our friends, is risky economically and risky politically. The question is, which stuff do we want to make in the United States for what reasons? Do we want to make it in the United States for industrial policy and technological leadership and jobs reasons? Do we want to make it in the United States for national security reasons? And where do we draw the line? Take solar cells. America was once the leader in solar panels. China basically undercut America's pricing, stole a lot of technology. They're now the leader. If we take it back, try to take it back with an industrial policy, that means we're paying more money in the short run for solar panels,
right?
Which is more expensive if we're trying to get rid of carbon. So it's complicated. You cannot settle this at the level of grand theory. You have to have some basic norms. We want a positive sum gain that helps American workers and also helps the third world. And then you got to get very specific.
Yeah. And often I think that missing from the conversation where we hear just this very vague and general, bring the production back home, there's very little discussion of the impact that that would have on the prices of many of the things that we're talking about, as you point out with solar panels, which is a decision that could be made. I mean, the decision could be made. Here's a list of 10 areas where we believe it's worth paying more. Here's how much access would be reduced for the American people as a result of that, but we believe it's worth it.
Well, and by the way, this is what Japan and Korea and China all did at earlier stages of their economic development. I mean, a Ricardian economist would have said to the Japanese, why in the world do you want to invest in an auto industry or a steel industry or a machine tool industry? Because you can get it cheaper from the United States. And the Japanese answer was, well, it depends on what your time horizon is. If your time horizon is this year, yeah. But if your time horizon is 50 years or 100 years or 1,000 years, we want that industry in our country because that's good for our economic growth and for our jobs. So you can't just take a snapshot at a point in time and look at the China price, look at the U.S. price, and say, oh well, obviously we got to buy from China. So it really, it's tricky, it's complicated, and you got to get into the details and the particulars.
Without question, without question. We've been speaking with Bob Kuttner, who's co-editor of The American Prospect, also chair at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. I really appreciate your time today and your insights.
Thanks so much for having me.